1940. The iron fist of the Third Reich has crushed Europe. France has fallen. The British army, broken and humiliated, has been thrown from the continent at Dunkirk. A German invasion seems not just possible, but inevitable. Britain stands utterly alone, staring into the abyss of total defeat. But in London, one man refuses to yield. Winston Churchill does not think of defence. He dreams of attack. He demands a weapon of vengeance. He writes a furious memo, demanding a new kind of warrior, a force that can strike terror into the heart of the enemy. He calls for specially trained troops of the hunter class who can develop a reign of terror down the enemy coast. He wants men who can butcher and bolt. This is the story of how that savage vision became a reality. This is the story of the birth of the Commandos, and by the end of this video, you will understand how these men, forged in the fires of desperation, became the steel blade that Britain plunged into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. The year 1940 was Britain's darkest hour. The miracle of Dunkirk had saved the men, but it had been a catastrophic defeat. Almost all of the army's heavy equipment, its tanks, its artillery, its transport, now lay rusting on the beaches of France. The nation was disarmed, vulnerable, and braced for invasion. The military leadership was locked in a defensive mindset, obsessed with holding the coastline against the expected German onslaught. But for Churchill, defence was a prelude to surrender. He knew that to survive, Britain had to attack. It had to show the world, and Hitler himself, that it was still in the fight. The idea came from a brilliant, unconventional staff officer named Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark. He proposed creating small elite, amphibious raiding units. He suggested a name that would echo with bitter irony for the British military establishment: Commandos. The name was taken from the Boer fighters who had humiliated the British Empire in South Africa just 40 years earlier. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, experts in raiding, sabotage, and survival. Now, Britain would create its own commandos. Churchill seized the idea with ferocious enthusiasm. He bypassed the traditional military hierarchy and ordered the immediate formation of these new units. Volunteers were sought from every corner of the British Army. The call went out for men who were physically supreme, utterly ruthless, and possessed by an aggressive, offensive spirit. Thousands volunteered, but only a handful would be chosen. And for those chosen, a special kind of hell awaited them. They were sent to the remote, windswept highlands of Scotland, to a place that would become legendary, Achnacarry Castle, known to all who passed through its gates as Castle Commando. Here, under the brutal command of men like Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan, the volunteers were systematically broken down and rebuilt into a new type of soldier. The training was merciless, designed to weed out anyone with a hint of weakness. The instructors were veterans of the toughest campaigns, and they used live ammunition in their training exercises. Men were shot at, forced to crawl through mud and barbed wire, while machine guns fired just inches over their heads. They were taught to kill silently with their bare hands and the iconic Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, a weapon designed for one purpose only: lethal, silent killing. They practiced amphibious landings on the freezing storm-lashed locks, paddling flimsy canvas canoes and inflatable boats. They were drilled in demolition, learning to use explosives to destroy railways, bridges, and enemy installations. The final test was a timed march of 36 miles, carrying full fighting equipment over the unforgiving Scottish mountains. Those who failed to complete it in time were immediately returned to unit, a humiliating dismissal that haunted every trainee. Achnacarry was a factory of warriors, and its product was the deadliest soldier the world had yet seen. They were not just soldiers. They were the physical embodiment of Churchill's will to fight back. The first commando raids were small, sharp, and vicious. They were butcher and bolt missions, designed to test tactics, gather intelligence, and, most importantly, to shatter the myth of German invincibility. In March of 1941, Operation Claymore saw commandos raid the Lofoten Islands in Nazi-occupied Norway. They destroyed fish oil factories vital to the German war effort, sank enemy shipping, captured code books, and returned to Britain with hundreds of Norwegian volunteers. These early raids were pinpricks, but they had an enormous psychological impact. They proved that the British could still strike anywhere, at any time. They forced Hitler to divert thousands of troops to garrison duties along his so-called Atlantic Wall, tying down men and resources that were desperately needed on other fronts. But these early successes were merely a rehearsal for the main performance. A new, far greater threat was emerging in the Atlantic. The German battleship Tirpitz, a 42,000-ton monster of steel and firepower, was nearing completion. If the Tirpitz broke out into the Atlantic, it could single-handedly annihilate the convoys that were Britain's lifeline. There was only one place on the entire Atlantic coast where such a beast could be repaired and serviced: the massive Normandy dry dock at the French port of Saint-Nazaire. That dock had to be destroyed. The mission was deemed so vital and so dangerous that it was given to the very best. It was a job for the Commandos. The plan, codenamed Operation Chariot, was breathtakingly audacious. It bordered on Suicidal. The Royal Navy would provide an obsolete First World War-era destroyer, HMS Campbelltown. Her bow would be packed with over 4 tons of delayed-action high explosives. She would be disguised to look like a German torpedo boat. This floating bomb, accompanied by a small flotilla of motor launches carrying the Commandos, would sail 70 miles up the enemy-held Loire estuary under the guns of hundreds of German coastal defences and ram the Campbelltown directly into the main gate of the Normandy dock. Once the ship was embedded, the Commandos, led by Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Charles Newman, would swarm ashore. Their job was to create maximum chaos and destruction, demolishing the dock's pumping stations, machinery, and gun emplacements. They were given a simple order: fight until the job is done. There was little hope of a successful evacuation. On the night of March 28, 1942, the raid began. As the small flotilla steamed up the river, they were spotted. German searchlights sliced through the darkness, locking onto the ships. The British naval commander, Robert Ryder, coolly used a captured German signal lamp to flash a message claiming they were friendly vessels. For a few precious minutes, the deception worked. But then, the Germans opened fire. The river erupted in a storm of cannon shells and machine gun fire. The wooden motor launches were shredded, turning into floating infernos. But the Campbelltown, with her reinforced bow, ploughed on through the hellstorm, her guns blazing. At precisely 1:34 a.m., she hit the dock gate at a speed of nearly 20 knots, smashing through the thick steel with a deafening screech of tortured metal. The first part of the mission was a success. Then came the Commandos. Newman was one of the first ashore, leading his men into a maelstrom of fire. They split into demolition teams, racing through the dockyard with their explosives. They were horrifically outnumbered, fighting a desperate battle in the darkness against an enemy that was now fully alerted. They blew up the pumping house, the winding gear for the lock gates, and every strategic target they could reach. The fighting was savage, often hand-to-hand. The Commandos fought with a cold fury, true to their butcher and bolt training. But their escape route was gone. The surviving motor launches had been destroyed. They were trapped. Newman gathered his surviving men. Their only chance was to fight their way into the town of Saint-Nazaire and try to escape overland to Spain. They fought in small groups from street to street until their ammunition ran out. Of the 600 men who set out on the raid, only a handful would ever make it back to Britain. Most were killed, or, once their ammunition was spent, captured. To the Germans, it seemed like a failed British raid. They had repelled the attack and captured the enemy commander. German officers and engineers swarmed over the wedged destroyer, inspecting the damage. They had no idea they were standing on top of a massive ticking time bomb. Hours later, at 10:35 in the morning, the 4 tons of explosives in the bow of the Campbelltown detonated. The blast was colossal. It vaporized the forward half of the ship, along with hundreds of German soldiers. The 50-ton caisson gate of the dry dock was ripped from its foundations and hurled down the dock. A tidal wave of water surged through, sweeping away everything in its path. The most important dry dock on the Atlantic coast was utterly and completely destroyed. It would remain out of action for the rest of the Second World War. Operation Chariot was a stunning strategic victory, bought at a terrible price. It was a testament to the unbelievable courage of the Royal Navy sailors and the Commandos. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded, the highest honour for bravery. The raid on St. Nazaire cemented the legend of the Commandos. It proved that in its darkest hour, Britain possessed men of extraordinary valour, capable of undertaking the most perilous missions imaginable. They were the tip of the spear, the physical embodiment of a nation's defiance. Their legacy is not just one of victory, but of a mindset. They created the template for almost all modern special forces, from the Special Air Service to the Navy SEALs. They proved that a small group of determined, highly trained warriors could change the course of history. They were Churchill's butchers, and their savage, heroic actions ensured that Britain and the world would not fall into darkness. The spirit of the Commandos is the spirit of a nation that refuses to be broken, an indomitable spirit. If you believe that spirit is still alive and well today, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to Indomitable History for more stories of our nation's greatest heroes. But what do you think? Was the St. Nazaire raid the most daring Special Forces mission in history? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.